Arman Tsarukyan, one of the lightweight division's most dangerous contenders, sat down with Joe Rogan and dropped an absolute bombshell that left even Joe speechless. We're talking about claims that Dana White, the president of the UFC, allegedly wants him out of the organization. This is massive, and we need to break down everything that happened, the context behind it, and what this means for the future of the lightweight division. So stick around, because this story has more layers than you might think. Before we get into the details, let me ask you this. How often do you hear a top-ranked UFC fighter openly say that the company president wants them gone? Almost never, right? Fighters usually play it safe. They toe the company line, smile for the cameras, and say all the right things. But Arman Tsarukyan? He threw caution to the wind and said what was really on his mind during his appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. And Joe's reaction? Pure shock. You could see it in his face. This wasn't just another interview about training camps and fight predictions. This was real, raw, and unfiltered. The kind of moment that makes you realize there's so much more happening behind the scenes in the UFC than what we see on fight night. So what exactly did Arman say? Why does he believe Dana White wants him out? And is there any truth to these claims? We're about to find out. For those who might not be completely familiar with Arman Tsarukyan, let me bring you up to speed, because understanding his journey is crucial to understanding why this controversy matters so much. Arman Tsarukyan is a 27-year-old Armenian fighter who competes in the UFC's lightweight division, arguably the most stacked and competitive division in all of mixed martial arts. This is the same division that has produced legends like Khabib Nurmagomedov, Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, and current champion Islam Makhachev. Arman made his UFC debut back in April 2019, and here's where his story gets really interesting. His very first fight in the octagon was against Islam Makhachev, who at the time was already being groomed as the next big thing in the lightweight division. This was supposed to be a showcase fight for Islam, a way to build his record with a relatively easy win. But Arman had other plans. Despite taking the fight on extremely short notice, just 2 weeks to be exact, Arman put on an incredible performance. He lost by unanimous decision, but he gave Islam one of his toughest fights to date. People watching that night knew they had witnessed something special. This wasn't just another fighter getting his shot. This was a legitimate contender announcing his arrival. Since that debut, Arman has gone on to compile an impressive record in the UFC. He's beaten top contenders, showcased incredible wrestling skills, devastating striking, and the kind of toughness that can't be taught. He's currently ranked among the top fighters in the lightweight division and has been calling for a title shot for months. So we're not talking about some journeyman fighter here. We're talking about a legitimate top contender who has paid his dues and earned his spot at the table, which makes what he said on Joe Rogan's podcast even more significant. Now let's get to the moment that has the MMA world buzzing. During his appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience, one of the most popular podcasts in the world with millions of listeners, Arman opened up about his relationship with the UFC brass, specifically Dana White. The conversation started normally enough, with Joe asking Arman about his recent performances and his ambitions in the division. But then things took a dramatic turn when the topic shifted to why Arman hasn't received a title shot despite his impressive winning streak. Arman didn't hold back. He expressed frustration with how he's been treated by the promotion, feeling like he's been overlooked time and time again despite doing everything right inside the octagon. He's won his fights, he's finished opponents, he's taken on tough challenges, and yet the title shot keeps eluding him. Then came the statement that made Joe's jaw drop. Arman suggested that Dana White doesn't want him to succeed, that there's a preference for other fighters in the division, and that he feels like he's being deliberately held back from getting the opportunities he deserves. Joe Rogan, who has been around the UFC for over 2 decades as a commentator and has seen everything in this sport, was visibly taken aback. You could see him processing what Arman was saying, trying to understand the full scope of the situation. Joe even pushed back a little, asking Arman to clarify and explain his reasoning. What made this moment so powerful was the sincerity in Arman's voice. This wasn't a publicity stunt or an attempt to create drama for social media clicks. This was a fighter genuinely frustrated with his situation, speaking his truth on one of the biggest platforms in the world. To understand why Arman feels this way, we need to look at the context of what's been happening in the lightweight division and some of the controversies that have surrounded him. First, let's talk about matchmaking. After his impressive debut against Islam Makhachev, Arman went on to build a strong record in the UFC. However, there have been multiple instances where title shot discussions came up, and Arman seemed to be passed over in favor of other fighters. One of the key issues has been the politics of the lightweight division. With fighters like Charles Oliveira, Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, and others all in the mix, getting a clear path to the title has been complicated for everyone, not just Arman. But from his perspective, he's done more than enough to earn his shot. There's also the question of promotional favoritism. In combat sports, it's no secret that promotions often push certain fighters over others based on various factors like marketability, fighting style, personality, and nationality. Arman has suggested that he doesn't fit the mold of what the UFC typically promotes, and that this has worked against him. Another factor that can't be ignored is money. UFC fighter pay has been a contentious issue for years, with many fighters speaking out about not being compensated fairly for the risks they take and the entertainment they provide. There have been reports, though not officially confirmed, that Arman has had disagreements with UFC management about his contract and pay structure. Then there's the incident that may have been a turning point. Earlier in his career, Arman was involved in a situation where he was fined by the UFC for an altercation with a fan. While the details of what happened are disputed, with Arman claiming he was defending himself, the UFC took action against him. Some believe this incident may have soured his relationship with Dana White and UFC management. All of these factors combined have created a situation where Arman feels like he's on the outside looking in, despite his skills and accomplishments inside the octagon. To fully understand this controversy, we also need to talk about Dana White and his management style, because he's not your typical sports executive. Dana White has been the president of the UFC since 2001 and is largely credited with transforming the organization from a struggling niche promotion into a multi-billion-dollar global sports empire. He's known for being outspoken, passionate, and fiercely protective of the UFC brand. But Dana also has a reputation for being tough on fighters who don't play ball. Over the years, we've seen numerous examples of fighters who have gotten on Dana's bad side and subsequently found themselves in difficult positions. Sometimes it's about money negotiations, sometimes it's about public criticism of the company, and sometimes it's about personal conflicts. Dana operates with a very clear philosophy. The UFC is bigger than any individual fighter. He's not afraid to cut ties with big names if they become problematic. And he's not shy about publicly criticizing fighters who he feels aren't living up to their end of the bargain. This has led to several high-profile disputes over the years. Fighters like Francis Ngannou, the former heavyweight champion, left the UFC partly due to contract disputes and disagreements with management. Nate Diaz had years of public back and forth with Dana before eventually departing. Even Conor McGregor, the UFC's biggest star, has had his share of conflicts with Dana, though they always seem to reconcile. The point is, Dana White is not someone you want to be on the wrong side of if you're a UFC fighter. He controls who gets the big fights, who gets promoted, and ultimately, who gets to stay in the organization. So when a fighter like Arman suggests that Dana doesn't want him around, it's not something to take lightly. Now let's talk about Joe Rogan's role in all of this, because his reaction to Arman's claims was significant. Joe Rogan is in a unique position in the MMA world. He's the voice of the UFC as its longtime commentator, but he's also known for being honest and independent-minded. On his podcast, Joe has never been afraid to speak truth to power, even when it comes to the UFC. Over the years, Joe has advocated for fighters getting paid more, criticized questionable judging decisions, and spoken out about issues within the sport. He has a genuine love for MMA and respect for the fighters who put their health on the line every time they step into the octagon. So when Arman made these claims on Joe's podcast, Joe's shock seemed genuine. You could see him trying to balance his loyalty to the UFC where he works, with his respect for Arman and his understanding of the fighter's perspective. Joe asked follow-up questions, trying to get to the heart of what Arman was saying. He wanted specifics. He wanted to understand if this was about personal conflicts, business disagreements, or something else entirely? This is what makes Joe such a good interviewer. He doesn't just accept things at face value. What was also interesting was that Joe didn't try to defend Dana White or the UFC blindly. He listened, he processed, and he acknowledged that Arman's frustrations seemed real. This kind of validation from someone like Joe Rogan is powerful because it tells the audience that these concerns are legitimate and worth taking seriously. We can't talk about UFC controversies without addressing the elephant in the room: fighter pay. This has been one of the most persistent issues in mixed martial arts for years. Unlike other major sports leagues, where athletes receive a much larger percentage of overall revenue, UFC fighters have long argued that they're not getting their fair share. The numbers back this up. In major sports leagues like the NBA or NFL, players receive approximately 50% of total revenue. In the UFC, estimates suggest fighters receive somewhere between 15 to 20% of total revenue. That's a massive difference, especially considering the physical toll that fighting takes on the body. Many fighters, including some of the sport's biggest names, have spoken out about this issue. They've pointed out that they have to pay for their own training camps, nutritionists, coaches, and medical expenses, all of which can cost tens of thousands of dollars for a single fight. If they're not making enough money from their fight purses, they can actually lose money fighting in the UFC. For someone like Arman Tsarukyan, who is a top contender but not yet a champion, the pay issue is particularly relevant. He's fighting the best guys in the world, putting on exciting fights, and taking significant risks, but he may not be getting compensated in a way that reflects his value. If Arman has been vocal about wanting better pay, and if the UFC has been resistant to meeting his demands, this could absolutely be a source of tension between him and UFC management. Dana White has been criticized in the past for his stance on fighter pay, often arguing that fighters are well compensated and should be grateful for the opportunities the UFC provides. This fundamental disagreement about money could be at the root of why Arman feels like Dana wants him out. If a fighter is constantly pushing for more money and challenging the promotion's pay structure, they might be seen as problematic by management. So where does this situation go from here? What are the possible outcomes for Arman Tsarukyan in his UFC career? One possibility is that nothing changes. The UFC could simply ignore Arman's comments and continue operating as usual. They might give him more fights but keep him away from the title picture, essentially confirming his suspicions that he's being held back. Another possibility is that this public statement forces a conversation. Sometimes when fighters go public with their grievances, it creates enough pressure that the promotion has to address the issues. We've seen this happen before with other fighters who spoke out and eventually got better deals or more favorable matchmaking. There's also the chance that this damages Arman's standing in the UFC even further. If Dana White and UFC management didn't appreciate him speaking out on such a massive platform, they could make things even more difficult for him. This is the risk that comes with being publicly critical of your employer. The best-case scenario for Arman would be that his performance in the octagon becomes impossible to ignore. If he keeps winning impressively and builds enough fan support, the UFC might have no choice but to give him the opportunities he deserves, regardless of any personal tensions with management. What do you think about Arman's claims? Do you believe Dana White wants him out? Or is this just a misunderstanding between a fighter and management? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you smash that like button. It really helps the channel. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest UFC content.